So I grew up in a really small town in Southern Ontario, which is located in Canada. And like your typical young Canadian boy, I basically grew up in hockey skates. From the time I could walk, I was, at the rink, playing the game of hockey, and I developed this deep, deep love for the game. Really an obsession. And it became abundantly clear to me from a really, really young age that hockey was the only thing I ever wanted to do. I remember thinking as a young kid that if I didn't play hockey for the rest of my life, I may as well not live anymore. That's how deep this love and desire was for the game of hockey, that I actually couldn't see a life without it. It made no sense to me. At the same time, there was actually something else that seemed to always be on my mind as I grew up, and that was this idea of God. And I think a big reason that God was on my mind a lot was a couple stories that I was told as a young kid. So my grandfather was in World War II, and he was part of a recon mission in the Battle of Ortona in Ortona, Italy in 1943. So my grandfather and his entire platoon, they got ambushed by the Germans and blown up by a bunch of grenades. And then the Germans walked around and they put a bullet in my grandfather's back to ensure that he would not survive. The result of this was that my grandfather was in a coma for about 6 months. And while he was in his coma, Jesus came to him. And Jesus told him that he was going to survive and that all he needed to do was just rest. So my grandfather did that, he rested, and after about 6 months, like I said, he emerged from the coma, returned home, and to a family that had already had his funeral because they'd received word from the military that he had died in that ambush with the rest of his platoon. Then, when my mom was about 6 years old, one night she woke up in the middle of the night and there was a man in her bedroom. And this man was glowing a vibrant light. He had shoulder-length hair, a beard, he wore a blood red robe over a white tunic, and he spoke to her. He said, "I will not harm you, do not be afraid." So I left a lot of details of these stories out for the sake of time, but I got a variation of these as a young kid. And for me, unlike the rest of my brothers, these stories had a deep impact on me. So I spent a lot of my youth into my adolescence, teenage years, thinking about God and feeling this desire for this connection with God, which was strange because we actually didn't grow up in the church at all. We actually never went to church, as a family on Sundays, and we were kind of taught a very basic, theological belief system, not a Christian one. And I think there were a number of reasons why we were kept out of the church. But basically, my parents had decided that they wanted us to figure out life on our own, to come to our own conclusions about things and not be indoctrinated by any kind of belief system from a young age. So I didn't really know anything about Christianity. And I didn't know, honestly, much about Jesus, other than perhaps that he was the Son of God and that he was this important figure, until I was about 17 years old, which was when I was given my first Bible by my best friend and his family. And I remember when I first read the words of Jesus, my life changed immediately, because I was finally linking these stories from my past, about this guy named Jesus, to who Jesus was and what he said and what he represented and what he did. And like I said, it changed my life. It changed me very, very quickly. And at one point, I realized that I just had this peace that I'd never felt before, this sense of internal freedom and joy that I couldn't explain. I actually had no explanation for it. And but it was a feeling that was better than any feeling I'd ever felt before. And I knew pretty early on that I wanted to be a Christian and I was going to live my life according to the teachings of Jesus. At the same time, though, I was actually leaving home for the first time to go play junior hockey in another city. And if ever anybody knows the culture of hockey, they know that the culture of hockey and the ideas of the Christian faith, they don't really coincide all that well together. So as I went away from home for the first time as a baby Christian, I found myself in a situation where I made a lot of mistakes, and I found myself losing this connection to God that I cherished so much. So as I came home after my first year of juniors, I decided I was going to double down on God and to try to keep this sense of connection to Him. And as life went on, I continued playing junior hockey. And one day I was reading the Bible and I came across a passage in Matthew 12 that talked about the unforgivable sin. And pretty soon after reading this passage, I became convinced that I'd committed that sin. And what it meant to me was that I'd lost my salvation. And I became 100% convinced that I was going to hell for eternity. So life became very bleak very quickly, and I slipped into a deep, deep, dark depression. And life completely lost its meaning. I remember growing up thinking that suicide was selfish on part of the person that committed suicide. Like, how could they do that to their family, to their friends? But from the position that I was in at that time, I realized that it was actually the opposite. That it would have been selfish for anybody to suggest that I should continue to live in this state that I was in this perpetual state of torment and hopelessness. And, I developed suicidal ideation and started thinking about what that might look like. My saving grace at the time was that I knew if I killed myself, I was just expediting my journey to hell. So I decided that I was just gonna pull myself up by my bootstraps, see if I could come out of this depression and avoid hell for as long as I could. So I ended up over time just distancing myself from God, from the Bible, and I became, just purely focused on hockey and, making my dream of being a professional hockey player come true. And my junior hockey career ended up being a very successful one, which created an opportunity for me to play Division I hockey. And I committed to playing Division I hockey in upstate New York and Rochester. So when I was about 20 years old, I headed down to school to, begin my college hockey career. And in college, I basically decided that I didn't want to live in fear of condemnation. So I was just going to open myself up to, as many ideas as possible and just play with different intellectual ideas, different spiritual ideas, and, see if I could find happiness. And at the same time, I was, studying engineering. So I was deeply immersed in the sciences, and I basically developed an entirely different worldview in which Jesus no longer fit in. While that was going on, like I said, I was playing Division I hockey, and I ended up having a very successful college hockey career as well, which opened the doors for me to sign a professional contract at the end of my college stint. And, after my senior year, I signed with the New York Islanders organization and, took that next step toward hopefully playing in the NHL one day. And I played in the Islanders organization for 3 or 4 years, just striving to, make that final goal come true of establishing a career in the NHL. And unfortunately, that opportunity never really manifested. And after being in the organization for about 4 years, I just felt like I'd been pigeonholed into a fourth line role that I just could not break out of, and that I was capable of producing more offense if I was just given the right opportunities. So I decided this year that I was going to take my career over to Finland to hopefully make a new name for myself, get a fresh perspective on me as a player, put up a lot of points and, make a name for myself as an offensive threat so that I could either eventually return back to North America for another kick at the NHL, or I would, just grow my career in Europe, make good money and enjoy life. But when I got to Finland, for the first time in a long time, I really started contemplating the existence of the Christian God again, the existence of Jesus. And I could not shake it. I could not shake it. I was doing a lot of research. I was watching, a lot of videos on near-death experiences and people claiming to have encounters with Jesus, all these different types of testimonies. I was reading the Bible, and like I said, just doing research in a lot of different ways. And I was having a really hard time reconciling this intellectual problem I was having because, like I said, in college, I was exposed to all these new ideas, all these different spiritual practices. I was educated deeply in the sciences, so I had this new worldview, which I felt could explain a lot of things. But I still couldn't shake this feeling that there was something about Jesus. And but I didn't know how to know if God was real. So I was praying a lot and continued doing my research. And I just got to a point where I realized that there was no way for me to realize the truth about God by, sitting in my apartment in Finland. And Jesus says in the Bible, seek and you will find, knock and the door will be opened. He says that if you lose your life for him, you'll find it. He tells a rich man that if he wants to inherit eternal life, that he must sell all his possessions, give to the poor, and follow him. And I just thought to myself, I don't know how to know if Jesus is real, but he makes some pretty clear statements here. And realistically, some promises that if you lose your life, you'll find it. And given the fact that for weeks and weeks, I couldn't shake this feeling, I just made a decision that I needed to walk away from the game and seek God. So I called my general manager and I told him that I was done with the game of hockey. I was walking away from this lifelong dream of mine of being a professional hockey player because I had these questions about God that needed to be answered. I thought that, despite the fact that I didn't know whether God was real or not, that if there was any chance in the world that Jesus was the truth, there's nothing I won't give up to find that out. You can't take anything with you to the other side, you lose everything anyways. So I may as well give it up on my own accord to see. And so that's what I did. I walked away from everything. And I flew back home with the plans of just seeking God, on knocking on doors to see what would open. And when I first got back home, I really heard nothing for a long time. I was doing a lot of praying, and I felt no indication that God was real, or at least no indication that God was acting in my life. And I was doing a lot of research trying to reconcile this intellectual problem I had. And at one point, I just sent out a bunch of emails, 3 or 4 emails to some different people that I felt had a connection to this God that I was seeking. And one of these individuals was a man named Afshin Javid. Now, Afshin is an ex-Hezbollah soldier that had an encounter with Jesus Christ in a prison cell in Malaysia back in the day. And I'd originally seen his testimony when I was about 17 years old, when I first became a Christian. And I'd seen his updated testimony on the Christian Broadcasting Network when I was in Finland. And I just thought, I may as well reach out to him. And he got back to me within a couple of days and told me to call him. So we got on the phone and spoke for a little while. And at the end of our conversation, he proposed this idea to me of, me coming down to the United States to travel with him while he did a ministry tour across the southern United States. And I thought, okay, well, I guess that makes sense. That seems like exactly what I would do if I was seeking God. So I just booked a bunch of flights and decided I was going to travel with Afshin. Now, between booking these flights and eventually flying out, I was spending a lot of time continuing to research, continuing to pray, and I was getting extremely frustrated because I would read parts of the Bible and things just did not make sense to me at all. Parts of the Old Testament seemed almost nonsensical to me, and I couldn't reconcile this problem I was having. And I was getting so frustrated that I was even screaming at God. I felt like there was no indication he was real, and I just laid down my entire life to find out if he was real, and I saw nothing. I felt nothing, and felt as if maybe I'd, made the biggest mistake anybody had ever made, giving up this lifelong dream of being a professional hockey player, and for nothing. And I was just begging for some kind of a sign that he was real. And at the same time, one of the people that I've been watching a lot of videos of, a lot of clips on, was this guy named Cliff Connectley. And Cliff is a Christian apologist that goes to university campuses and answers really tough questions that are proposed by university students. And I felt like Cliff did a really good job at answering these questions. And I thought to myself, man, it'd be nice to ask Cliff some of my questions. If there's anybody that might be able to answer some of my questions to help me make sense of things enough to actually believe in Jesus, to believe in the Christian God intellectually, then perhaps it's this Cliff guy. And shortly after having this thought, I was flying out of the Pearson Airport in Toronto to eventually go meet up with Afshin. And my flight that morning was supposed to go out at 8:10, but there was a security breach at the airport, which caused my flight to be delayed by about 2 hours. So eventually I get on the plane at about 10:25, and I sit on the plane for about 2 hours, and we had to deboard because at that point they needed to reschedule the flight staff. So finally we get off the ground at about 3 p.m., somewhere around 7 hours late. And towards the end of the flight, probably in the last 15 to 20 minutes, I get this thought in my head about Cliff. And this clip of a podcast that I just recently watched where Cliff, his son Stuart, were on the George Jankel podcast, and they were discussing what a Christian's obligation is to, financially, to the church, to charity, to good works, and things of that nature. And I just began to have this entire conversation in my head about how much money I had and how much money I could take out to do good works with in the name of Jesus. And like I said, this conversation went on for several minutes in my head. And the plane lands, I get off the plane, I walk out of the tunnel into the airport, and I take about 10 steps into the airport, and Cliff and his son Stuart walked directly in front of me, like directly in my line of sight. And as soon as my eyes met them, it felt like I got sucker punched in the soul. Like I stepped into a whole nother dimension or something. It was a very strange feeling. And, it's impossible for me to articulate how perfect the timing was on this. Had I entered the airport, even a second earlier or later, I probably never would have seen them. Just the way that they were walking and the way that I entered the airport, it was perfect timing. And, without hesitation, I just ran straight up to Cliff and Stuart, and I began trying to explain what just happened to me and my situation and everything. And we ended up speaking for a few minutes, and Cliff and Stuart were very kind and very receptive. And at the end of the conversation, I just said to Cliff, if I ever have any questions, is there any way for me to contact you? And Cliff gave me his email, and his son Stuart gave me his Instagram handle. And afterwards, I was like, what just happened? Like, what on earth just happened? Because that's crazy. Like, I'm praying for a miracle. I'm praying for some kind of a sign that God's real. And I think that, I need things to intellectually make sense to me. And I think that if there's one guy that might be able to make sense of things to me, then maybe it's Cliff Connectley. And then within days of thinking that, Cliff just shows up in front of me in a way that I can't explain. and I'm given this opportunity to ask him my questions. And, I walked away from that situation like very confused, still contemplating whether or not that could seriously be a coincidence, because if it was, then that was, the most unlikely coincidence I've ever heard of. And a couple of days later, I actually had a realization that kind of changed the way I saw things. And the realization was that this interaction with Cliff actually was more beautiful than I'd realized. You see, it painted a picture, and that picture was this picture of what God's willing to do to bring his lost sheep home. You see, what caused all these delays that morning at the airport was that a flight from Calgary had came in, and some kind of security malfunction occurred, which caused this entire plane of people to get let off into the wrong section of the airport. They were somewhere where they didn't belong. So they shut down the international side of the airport and sent out angels of the airport to run around and collect all these lost sheep to bring them back home. Well, at the same time, I'm sitting in this airport, watching all these agents run around trying to collect all these lost sheep. And I'm a lost sheep. And I was about to get on a plane because I was trying to come home, but I just didn't know if there was a home to come to. And when I realized this picture, it not only did it blow my mind, but it kind of acted as that final piece of resolution to me that this was an act of God. It had to be. And if I had any other doubts, my next 2 weeks traveling with Afshin just kind of resolved a lot of those, because I was bombarded by things that I just could not explain. The impossible. Like, I would pray for answers to things, and have somebody come to me and tell me that God told them the answer to my prayer. Impossible things. And it just became pretty abundantly clear to me that not only is God real, but God's an active God. He's a living and loving God, and he wants to be involved in our lives. All we have to do is ask him, to seek him, to knock, and those doors will be opened. So I just want to encourage anybody listening that, if they're inspired by this story in any way, to go on their own journey of seeking and knocking, because I promise you, if you do, God will answer that door and welcome you in with open arms, despite what you've done in your life, despite what you think about the world and how you think the world works. Because I'll be the first to say it, that as somebody who thought I had some kind of an understanding about how the world worked, I have absolutely no idea how things really work, because I've seen and experienced and heard so many stories over the last couple months that just do not fit into the worldview, the scientific worldview that I came out of college with. So I'm looking forward to what life has ahead, and to continue to experience these, these amazing elements of life that I just wasn't exposed to before.